This episode is brought to you by BattleBards, premier tabletop audio for your campaigns. Use the coupon codes GMJ1, 2, or 3 to get free bonus tracks with your first order at battlebards.com. Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, gamer! Greetings, fellow GM and/or player. Welcome to episode 110 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and I'm transmitting to you today from the Obsidian Monolith somewhere outside time and space. Today, I'll discuss your feedback on a variety of RPG-related topics. So crack open a cold one, sit back, relax, and roll for initiative. So yes, today is a feedback episode. I have had so much feedback coming in lately that I realized that unless I did an entire episode going over feedback, there is no way I would ever get to all of it or even most of it. So that's what we're doing today. And we'll start out with a message I received from David Howard. And David says, "My name is David Howard, and I have been an active DM/GM and player of role-playing games for almost 40 years. So David's been in the game even longer than I have. Way to go, David. I started with Redbox Dungeons & Dragons and have played plenty of other games since. I love role-playing games and the storytelling and creativity that they engender. Without sounding too much like a fanboy, I wanted to write to you because I am a fan of Game Master's Journey and GM Intrusions before it. You will have to forgive me since I'm playing catch-up in Game Master's Journey after having played catch-up with GM Intrusions as well, since I didn't discover the shows until last year. You might have already addressed some of the things I'm mentioning, but in case you haven't, I wanted to give you some of my thoughts about the future of Game Master's Journey." Awesome. And even if I did address it, in 110 episodes, I can probably come back to things every once in a while. First, I love the show. I loved GM Intrusions and was very sad when it ended, but I can understand the desire to shift focus and discuss other things and other systems. Plus, I loved the focus on what it takes to be a good or even great game master and ideas and suggestions for achieving this to become worthy of the title, of course. I have loved your enthusiasm for the subject of role-playing games, and I like the fact that without a co-host, it makes each episode much more personal, almost as if you're simply having a conversation with the listener as opposed to talking at them. That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. That's definitely kind of what I go for with this show. One comment that I got on GM Intrusions long ago that still sticks with me because I really appreciate that comment was that people felt like it wasn't just my show, but that it's our show, partly because I would have so many listeners on the show as guests and share feedback and whatnot. And I think that's awesome because, I think if this show were just me on a microphone every week blabbing on about my opinions and thoughts, it would be a pretty dull show. But I think between having guests on the show and just having people write in and sharing what other people have to say, it makes the show something special. Currently, I am listening to your review of the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. It was this episode that finally prompted me to write to you. I always enjoyed your review episodes on GM Intrusions, and I would really like this feature to continue on Game Master's Journey too. Your opinion of the products has sometimes prompted me to either invest in an item or give it a pass. I think the reviews are honest, and I appreciate that. It's not shilling a product It's not shilling a product. It's simply telling me as the potential buyer what the product is and what it isn't, and then I can make my own choice. That's awesome. I'm so happy to hear that, David. That is exactly what I go for in my reviews. I do a lot of my actual shopping online. And even when I buy something in an actual store, I will usually research it online first. And I always read reviews, whether it's on Amazon or Yelp or anywhere that I can find the thing I'm curious about reviewed by people. I always read reviews. And as someone who reads a lot of reviews, I've learned that unfortunately, a lot of reviews are kind of worthless because it seems like a lot of the reviews you see out there are either someone who just loves a thing and thinks it's perfect and can't find any fault with it and just goes on and on and on about how awesome the thing is, or someone who hates the thing or had a bad experience or is pissed off about something, about whatever the thing is, and thinks the thing is the worst thing ever to happen and has nothing good to say about it, right? So you get like the two extremes, neither of which are really helpful for me as someone wondering, do I want to buy this book or whatever? You know, to hear from someone that just loves everything, for instance, that Wizards of the Coast does and thinks that Wizards of the Coast shit's gold and just goes on with this glowing review and can't find a single fault with the thing. That review is useless to me because honestly, there's nothing out there that you can't find some fault with or can't find some way that it could be improved on, right? So to read a review of something that has nothing negative or nothing that's not glowingly positive to say about a thing tells you, or at least tells me, that this person is so biased that their opinion is meaningless and worthless to me. And kind of the same thing with the person who's leaving the really nasty, terrible review. You know, even some of the worst things out there have something about them, you know, that's worthwhile. For instance, just to pick an example, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. You know, a lot of people say it's a terrible movie. A lot of people say it's the worst Star Wars movie ever made. A lot of people say it's not even Star Wars. But there are also people that really like the movie. And although I tend to think that it does not live up to the original movies and it was pretty bad, there were things about The Phantom Menace that I thought was really cool. I thought the battle between Darth Maul and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan was awesome and was, even now, I think, still the best, or at least one of the best fight sequences in any Star Wars movie. I mean, it was awesome. It was super cool. I thought some of the things that we saw Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon do that we hadn't seen Jedi do before then in the original movies was cool. So, you know, I'm not going to sit here and say The Phantom Menace was a steaming pile of poo and there's nothing good to say about it. I mean, it had its good things, right? So when I'm looking for a review, I'm looking for a balanced review. I'm looking for someone who's able to say, here's what I liked, here's what I didn't like, and someone who's not completely swept up by their emotions, right? Kind of a dispassionate review. And so that's what I try to do. I do try to, for the most part, I only review things I really like. So I tend not to do reviews of products I don't care for, just because I have limited time and I'd rather spend that time on the show talking about something that I do recommend you check out, as opposed to talking about something I don't recommend you check out and telling you why I don't recommend it. Also, you know, there's the idea of even bad press is good press, right? So if I really don't like a certain product, why on earth would I advertise it on the show by talking about it or even devoting a whole episode to it? Now, there's one huge exception in the in the Game Master's Journey archives. And that's when I did my review of the Star Wars role-playing game. And I got a little bit of flack about that from some people who didn't like the review because it was negative or thought I was unfair or whatever. And that was an interesting learning experience for me to see, well, what will happen if I do a negative review? What will be the response? And I will say that I've had far more feedback from people who appreciated the review and found it helpful to them in deciding whether or not they wanted to invest their hard-earned money in that particular role-playing game. I've received far more feedback from people who valued the review and it helped them make a decision one way or the other than I did from people who were complaining because they thought it was too negative or whatever. But I did get those complaints, and I've never gotten complaints on a review before. So that was interesting. But the reason I did that particular one is because I had already devoted so many episodes of the show to the Star Wars role-playing game. And I spent a lot of time kind of saying how I thought it was really cool and I was really excited to play it and everything. And it was only after I'd had, quite a bit of experience on both sides of the table with the game that I realized it wasn't for me and realized that there's some real problems with it. And I honestly felt it would be disingenuous of me not to do a full review of it, because if I wouldn't have done that episode, someone who listened to the show would come away with the impression that, well, Lex thinks the Star Wars RPG by Fantasy Flight Games is really good and I should check it out. And that's not the truth. I don't think it's a really good game. I think it's an okay game. I think it might be even a great game for certain people that like really crunchy, unwieldy, cumbersome systems. But it's not for me. And it's not for people like me who like more elegant systems that are easy to arbitrate and fast, where you can keep things going and keep things moving. So I'm glad that people value the reviews. I'm glad that David values the reviews, and I am going to do more reviews on the show. Now, this is not a review show, so I'm not going to try to review everything out there. I'm mainly going to talk about things that I use myself. So I'm going to talk about games I'm playing myself. I'm going to talk about products that I have myself. Now, that's not to say if you're a publisher or a writer or a game designer, or you're just someone that loves a particular game and you want me to check it out and you want to send me a review copy, that's not to say that I won't check it out and that I might not review it on the show. But chances are I'm only going to review it if I really like it and I decide this is something I'm going to get into, because, to really understand something to the level that I need to really give a good review of it, it takes a lot of time. And I don't have a lot of time actually to game once everything's said and done. So of course I'm going to spend that time focusing on the things that I enjoy the most, right? So, I'm not going to promise to review anything. It's got to be something I'm interested in. And, I've had more than one person suggest or request that I review things, for instance, on the Dungeon Masters Guild. And again, if I come across something that I think is really awesome, then yeah, I'll probably share it with you, but I'm not going to go spend time on the Dungeon Masters Guild every week just to find things to review, because it's just not a good use of my time. And honestly, unless I'm going to go on to Dungeon Masters Guild to find something that I'm going to use myself in my game, it's just not going to happen. And a further point of honesty, it's not going to happen anyway, because I don't find 5th edition that hard to design for. If I need a spell or a domain or something, I'm just going to create it myself. I'm not going to go look on the Dungeon Masters Guild. I'm not going to go look on a forum or anything like that, or even third-party publishers. I'm going to create it myself. And part of that is probably a, what do you call it? A prejudice, maybe? I'm not sure if that's the right word. But part of that maybe come from the 3rd edition open gaming license days and just how the market was glutted with all this terrible content. But from that, I definitely have this impression within me that fan-created stuff tends not to be very good, and even third-party created stuff tends not to be very good. Or at the very least, you have to really take a hard look at it, right? If Wizards of the Coast puts out a new archetype for a class, I don't feel like I have to sit there and spend hours picking it apart and trying to figure out if it's going to break my game or not, or if it's going to outclass other archetypes or not. I assume that Wizards knows what they are doing and that I can trust that it's balanced and it's been play tested and it's a good addition to my game, right? And then as I introduce it and play with it, then maybe, I'll have to tweak it or whatever. But if I get something from the DM's Guild, I have no clue who this person is. I have no idea how much experience, if any, they have designing for RPGs. I don't know how much they care about balance. Is this person a GM or is this person a player? Players don't care about balance. And you can almost spot a feat or a spell or a magic item that was created by a player as opposed to a GM because it'll be broken. GMs will at least try to experienced GMs who know what they're doing will at least try to make things balanced. I think a lot of us as GMs in the beginning, we go through that phase where we give out totally broken magic items to our players, and we come up with new dice rolling conventions for ability scores that are broken, and all the, we come up with these overpowered things. And it's only through experience that we learn why that's a bad idea, or at least that's how it was for me. And I see a lot of new GMs, who, you look at the player characters and their campaigns and they've got Vorpal swords and Holy Avengers at 5th level and all this stuff. And you're like, yeah, I used to do that. And then I learned. So anyway, so these Unplugged episodes might be a little tangential, just so you know. But that's by an intent, because I'm not going to spend hours and hours editing these because, but we'll get into that. I'm going to explain more about the Unplugged format in a minute. I know that's coming up. So I'm not going to go looking on the Dungeon Masters Guild for things to review. I'm probably not even going to go looking for things for my game because, again, it's just easier for me to do it myself. And then I know that I am trying to make it balanced, and I'm, at least I think I understand the philosophy behind the design of, for instance, feats in 5th edition. And Mike Merles just wrote an awesome Unearthed Arcana on kind of how they approach feats and what they're thinking. And honestly, I don't even want to look at a feat designed by someone who hasn't read and understood that article, which means anything that came out before a month or two ago or a week or two ago is kind of like, well, they don't even know how to design a feat. How can they, unless they work for Wizards or they're really good at figuring it out by reading between the lines, which some people can do that, but a lot of people can't. So anyway, I guess my point is I feel like in the time it would take me to find something decent on the DM's Guild or elsewhere for my game, I could have created the thing myself. And if I create it myself, it's exactly what I need. And I will talk about this in future world building episodes, but I'm actually considering for Primordia creating my own domains. I think that the domains in 5th edition do a good job as far as giving a wide variety of optional abilities for clerics and different spells to give them access to. And as far as from a kind of gamist perspective of, hey, let's take the spells that clerics don't have and let's kind of spread them out between the domains. I think they did a pretty good job of that. But as far as the domains representing key elements of reality that would be portfolios of a god, they're pretty terrible. And in my world of Primordia, where each god is associated with a specific domain and each domain is only associated with one god, it doesn't work really well. It would work really better if the domains were better thought out conceptually to represent like the foundations of reality or the elements of reality or something like that. So it's very possible that I will create my own domains for Primordia to replace the domains in the player's handbook. Or another route I might go is taking the domains that we have and just changing them or adding to them. But again, I'll talk more about that in a world building episode sometime. But again, I'm not going to go trolling the internet looking for fan created domains because that would take a lot of time. And in that amount of time, I could create my own. And I'd rather do that anyway. That's why I'm a game master, because I like creating my own stuff. All right, back to David's email. I also really enjoyed the Unplugged episodes. Here we go. It's here where I thought that you could really do the product reviews or the letters from listeners. I believe the Unplugged format would give you a chance to be much more freeform in what content you want to put out, as opposed to the interview episodes, or where you want to discuss a particular topic, such as building encounters or talking about world building, or even talking about particular gaming systems. You could review products, read listener feedback, or even answer listener questions. And that's a great idea, and that's exactly what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing right now. This is one of those episodes, David. David gave me this idea, and I'm running with it. So this is an Unplugged feedback episode. And, David really had a great idea here, and it was great timing, because I have all this feedback. It's been kind of building up, and it's good feedback. I'm not going to read feedback just to read feedback. I won't necessarily read every little thing someone sends in. But if it's something that I think is going to add to the show, then I definitely want to use it. And, there's just, I can't keep up with one episode a week, an hour long. There's no way I can keep up with the feedback that comes in. So I was thinking of how to handle that when David's suggestion came in. And that's a great solution, because if I do these feedback episodes kind of more on the fly, and I don't spend so much time editing them, then it doesn't take me as long to produce them, which means in the same amount of time, I can produce a longer episode and cover more feedback. So I know I've done polls numerous times through the life of the show about, what length of episode people like. And it seems like, if I can keep the episodes between about 45 minutes and an hour, I get that's works for the most people. The majority of the people that responded to my surveys prefer, episodes of 45 minutes or episodes of an hour. And once you get beyond an hour, that's when you really start losing people. So another thing is these Unplugged feedback episodes, I'm going to let them go long if they need to. If I'm hitting an hour and I've only got a few more pieces of feedback to get through, I may just keep going. And because, I'm not editing these so much, I don't have to worry about, now it's going to take me another 2 hours to edit this episode because I went over half an hour or whatever. I don't have to worry about that. And also, those of you that don't like longer episodes, then you'll know that, the feedback episodes tend to be longer, so maybe you want to skip those. Or those of you that don't like the less edited episodes, that complain about the Unplugged episodes, then you can skip those. So I think it's a great way to kill a bunch of birds with one stone, and I think it'll be fun, and we'll see how it goes. We'll see what everyone thinks. So yeah, I'm not going to edit these episodes to the degree I normally do. So they may be more rambly, there may be more ums and uhs, because I'm not going to go cut all that stuff out. And also, I'm responding to feedback, so the topics will jump around quite a bit as I go from feedback to feedback, to the point that I don't even know when I hit record what all I'm going to talk about. So it's much more on the fly. I haven't written this ahead of time. It's unrehearsed. And so, my thoughts may not be as well thought out as maybe they normally are on the show. But think of it almost like a live episode. So that's what we're going to do with these feedback episodes. All right, back to the email. The world building episodes have been some of my favorites. Yeah, a lot of people say that. Seems like the world building episodes are definitely the favorite of quite a few listeners, more so than any other kind of episode I do. I enjoyed listening to you build your Numenera campaign, and he's referring to the Obsidian Monolith episodes. And I've enjoyed listening to you create and refine ideas that would become Primordia. Cool name, by the way. Thank you. Those episodes have inspired me to get involved with world building and put aside the Forgotten Realms for a while. Good for you. Just say no to the realms. To that end, I've been working on 2 different campaign worlds. One is based on Stephen King's The Dark Tower books with a 5th edition D&D flavor, and the other is much more sword and sorcery than high fantasy. So I did mention this in a previous episode. David sent me a couple fairly long emails, and so I cover bits of his emails in various episodes as I cover various topics. David goes on to say, thanks for urging your listeners to give it a go. It's been a long time since I developed a campaign world, but I'm having a good time doing it. I look forward to future episodes of the podcast. You're doing a great job. Well, thank you, David. Thank you so much for the feedback and for the email. And I'm really glad you're enjoying the world building. I'm enjoying doing it. And, it's funny because, not everybody likes world building and people have different opinions on it as far as whether they prefer running in their own world or running in a published world. And people have different strategies, whether they go bottom up or top down, macrocosm to microcosm or vice versa. So it's interesting, and, I had Matt Colville on the show recently, and he talked about how he prefers published settings just because it's less work, or it seems like it to him. And, world building is a lot of work, and that's true. It is. But I would argue that running in a published setting is a lot of work too. Yes, when a player asks you a question, you don't have to always pull it out of your ass. That answer might be in a book somewhere, but then you have to go find it. And nothing kills momentum in a gaming session than stopping to go look something up in a book. And, that's kind of the problem with published adventures too. And, a great example of this is if you check out Dice Camera Action, which is Chris Perkins running the Curse of Strahd campaign. And he does a great job. I mean, Chris is a great DM, don't get me wrong. However, I want to point out, if you watch that, you will see times where the momentum and the pacing of the game is destroyed because Chris has to fumble through the book to find something. And he wrote the thing. Or he helped. He was on the team that created Curse of Strahd, and he's losing pacing in his game, having to look stuff up in a book. And that is not going to happen to you as much with, a non-published campaign, an adventure you came up with yourself. But that's just one of the downsides of running a published adventure and using a published campaign world is the answers are there in a book somewhere, but you got to find it, and it takes time to find it. Or then you come up with something on the fly, and then what do you do if it contradicts what's in the setting book, right? So I don't know. I think we could have a very lively debate about whether it's more or less work to world build your own setting than to do a campaign setting. I think a lot of it has to do with how you approach it, right? If you think that you need 30,000 years of history and you need to, a world map and continents and all this stuff before you start, then yeah, it's a lot of work. But if you think that all you really need to start is what you need for that first session, then it's really not that much work. And, I know on the interview, Matt talked about how, he thinks it's really important to have a map, and that's a lot of work right there. So if you feel like you have to have a map, then you just added a lot more work to your plate than if you can get by without one or get by with just a sketch or whatever. And I don't know. Back in the Middle Ages, how many people had any concept of a map or where anything was in relation to anything else? Pretty much nobody. So why do your player characters really need a map at first level? I don't think they do. All right. So thank you, David. And I wanted to cover his feedback in the very beginning of the show here because he was the one that gave me the idea for the format of this episode for our Unplugged feedback episode.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
So real quick, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to my Tier 6 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. I want to thank Steve and all of the patrons for supporting the show. I really, really appreciate it. You guys are the best. Could not do it without you. And becoming a patron of Star Walker Studios is just one of the many great ways that you can support the show, and you can find all of the ways you can help out in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey. And if you become a patron, there are some cool perks that you get in addition to that feeling of satisfaction knowing that you are helping to support something that you love and so many enjoy for free. One of the other ways that you can help support the show is to check out BattleBards at battlebards.com. And I have a few coupon codes that you can use on your first order at battlebards.com to get some free bonus tracks. BattleBards provides you with quality premium audio for your tabletop RPG experience. So whether you need some background music or some ambient sounds like tavern sounds or forest sounds or ocean sounds or anything like that, or whether you need monster sounds, things like that. You can find all kinds of stuff like that at BattleBards. And again, check out the show notes and check out my coupon codes, and you can get some free tracks with your first order. All right, got some more feedback to get through today. I got a letter from Zortberg. He says, I'm that guy who left the 2 wall of text comments on your cleric episodes on the website. Yeah, thanks for those. I've been running back through older episodes and originally intended to listen to them all before really commenting again, but I'm halfway through and I just have to send an email earlier than I expected. And Zortberg says he skipped a few episodes. He's been skipping around. He's been cherry picking, which is fine. That's the nice thing about having over 100 episodes in the archives, that there's plenty to cherry pick from. I've been role-playing for about 4 years now, almost exclusively in D&D and Pathfinder, despite my best efforts to expand my horizons. Yeah, I hear you. I hear you on that. It's just so easy to find players for D&D and Pathfinder. It's hard to get people to try other games sometimes. But recently, I've been really interested in game design to the point that I'm currently trying to build my own system to play with some friends. One of the biggest helping factors in making a game has been, for me at least, listening to other people's opinions on games. It mostly started with Matt Colville's videos on what he finds important in running a game for players, and thankfully that also led me to your podcast. Awesome, so you found me through Matt's YouTube channel. That's awesome. Several of your episodes up to episode 53, namely the Elegance and RPG episodes, and all the episodes where you talk about other RPG mechanics and such, have already got me thinking about ways to improve my work that I never would have thought about on my own. In particular, you mentioned in episode 53 that a good measure of how fun a system is how engaged are the players when it's not their turn. This is something that I should have thought of immediately. As a player, I've had a hell of a hard time staying engaged in Pathfinder games despite my best efforts, and I've watched other players suffer from the same thing when I was a Pathfinder DM. Yeah, I had the exact same experience. Pretty much most, if not all, of my most boring memories of playing an RPG were playing Pathfinder when it wasn't my turn and just sitting there like, oh my God. And the worst of those were at Pathfinder Society games, in gaming stores or whatever, because those were the worst, because that's your munchkins just came out of the woodwork. And it was like a board game. It was moving miniatures on a map, rolling dice, crunching numbers, no role playing, no story, no fun. Still, it wasn't until I got to hear someone else talk about it that I even considered it as a factor in designing a game. So yeah, I don't remember saying that. That was 50 episodes ago, but yeah, that's great advice. How engaged are the players when it's not their turn? That's a great way to evaluate your game and what's going on in your game. I'm super psyched since I still have 53 episodes to go until I'm fully caught up. And once I've done that, I can still go back and catch the episodes I skipped the first time around. And I'm sure that I'll find even more useful insights as I listen to you and the people you interview. So thanks again for such an awesome podcast, and I hope you keep it up for at least another 106 episodes. Awesome. So thank you so much for that, Zortberg. That's a great email. Glad you're enjoying the show, and I wonder if you're caught up by now. So obviously, when you sent this to me, you were up to episode 106, or I was up to episode 106, and this is episode 110. So you're probably caught up by now. Got another email from G. Ferguson, or as I'm going to call him, G. Ferg, who says, "Wow, man, I just listened to your latest podcast while at work, number 108, and lo and behold, I get some mentions. Too cool. Thanks a bunch, dude. It really made my day." Well, that's awesome, man. Thanks for writing in. You've written in some really thoughtful emails, and I'm happy to share it on the show because, you know, I like that people like that I don't have co-hosts. I think it keeps the show much more focused, and you know, I don't get derailed as much by myself as we would if we had more people here, I'm sure. And it's just so much easier logistically to produce a show when I don't have to worry about other people showing up and being dependable and whatnot. Because I used to, in the early days of the show, I worried about, oh, it's just me by myself. Are people gonna dig that? But I very rarely hear from someone who thinks that I should have a co-host, and far more often I hear from people that like the fact that I don't have a co-host. But one of the possible problems with not having a co-host is that I'm concerned that it's just my opinion, right? And, you know, even the most interesting, intelligent person on the planet, which I assuredly am not, will get boring if they're all you listen to all the time, right? Not to mention, you know, you're just hearing one point of view, and especially when it comes to being a game master, there's never just one right answer. That's the one rule of being a game master that you can take to the bank, that you can carve in stone. There's never one right answer that works for everybody. And I challenge you that that's the case. Because there are a lot of things that are accepted out there by a lot of people that, for instance, I don't agree with. And that's not the way I run my games. Doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean I'm wrong. Just different strokes for different folks, right? So that's one of the many reasons that I really value listener feedback, is because it's a way to get some more opinions on the show. It's a way to get some more points of view on the show. And it's a way for me to kind of know what you're thinking and how you're reacting to what I'm presenting. And you give me great ideas. So I'm saving some of G. Ferg's email for some future world building episodes. He got into some world building stuff that I'm not going to go into today. But he says, "I was wondering about your thoughts on a discussion I had about fantasy." All right, this could be interesting. "Most folks equate high and low fantasy with hard and soft sci-fi." Okay, I'll take your word for that. I've never heard that myself. I've never made that connection myself. Could work. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it. But I think that's a false equivalence. Yeah, probably. I don't know. I think you're getting into trouble trying to compare sci-fi and fantasy. Since magic is effectively the tech level in fantasy, and the hard and soft in sci-fi has more to do with plausibility and realism. Yeah, I'd agree with that. Magic is kind of taking the place of technology in fantasy. And yeah, you know, the defining element of hard sci-fi is that it's scientifically accurate, or at least as much as it can be. So fantasy can be hard or soft, while high and low encompasses something else entirely. Someone like George R.R. Martin would be considered hard fantasy as well as low because of the lower magic, and hard due to many parallels in history, mannerisms, medieval mindset. Just wondering what you think about this. I'm really not sure. I haven't heard the parallel made between fantasy and science fiction like that. And I don't really ever hear the term soft sci-fi. I don't know that that's even a thing. There's hard sci-fi, and I guess by soft sci-fi, you're saying not hard sci-fi, but I've never actually heard that as an actual term. Yeah, so George R. R. Martin, I believe, is what's called low fantasy. Is that even the right term? I feel like that's not the right term. And I think that's partly because it's low magic, but it's really not. or at least, I mean, I didn't read the book. I read the first book. I thought it was terrible, but I haven't read the other books. But I'm watching the show, and at least in the show, it seems like the further we get in the show, the more you realize it's not low magic. It's just the magic is kind of hidden, and we just haven't seen a lot of it yet. But and I don't want to spoil Game of Thrones for people, but let's just say there's plenty of magic in that setting. It seems like as you get further in the show. I think it's more low fantasy, if that's even the right term, because it's more gritty and it's more, people are dirty, like literally dirty, like people aren't clean all the time. And a lot of fantasy, it's just kind of dumb. I'm sorry, but it is. It's just like Lord of the Rings. Like you watch those movies, and it's like everybody's immaculately clean. It's like, how are they so clean? They don't have running water. They're out traveling in the wilderness. How are they so clean all the time? So yeah, I guess I don't really have an opinion on that, G Ferg. You might be onto something, or you might be out in left field. I don't really know. To me, I guess I don't really know about classifications, but to me, what's interesting about something like Game of Thrones isn't so much that there's less magic, if there is less magic. It's the attempt at realism, as far as, this is what happens when you ride a horse for a long time. You can't gallop a horse all day long. Or, this is what it's like to be in heavy armor. Like you can't swim in heavy armor, people who play D&D and Pathfinder, or any armor. There's at least an attempt made to at least have a nod toward realism that fantasy often lacks. And I think it's really interesting because the books weren't so much like that, or at least in some ways weren't like that. I don't really know anything about George Martin, but judging from reading his book, I would guess he's a city boy because he doesn't seem to understand that forests at night are really dark and you can't see colors in darkness. But anyway, that is one thing that really bothered me in that book was reading a book about people out in the wilderness at night, written by someone who obviously has no experience being out in the wilderness at night. And it just completely destroyed my suspension of disbelief because it was ridiculous. So, sorry, G Ferg, that I don't have more for you on that. He says, finally, are you planning on having any other cultures in Primordia? I figure Elandria is kind of the default fantasy setting, quasi-Western European, but is there a possibility of, say, other cities based off of different cultures? A giant Slavic grad, I'm not sure if I'm reading right, Mesoamerican, perhaps an African based off of Mali or something from Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I just find other cultures interesting and like the idea of putting other folks in fantasy. So to answer that, yes and no. Yes, I will definitely be using other cultural elements. Something you may not know about me is I have a bachelor's degree in anthropology. So I too am very interested in other cultures, and I have been exposed to a lot of cultures that, 99% of people out there don't know anything about and are very different from anything that most people have had any experience or knowledge of. So I've always thought that, those are gold mines for bringing things into a fantasy setting that are different and aren't just your generic quasi-European Middle Age / Renaissance culture. However, that being said, I don't think it's very smart or very original or very interesting to just base cultures in a fantasy setting on real world cultures. So I'm not going to I'm not going to say Elandria is China from this, this time period, or it's Japan from this time period, or it's the Aztecs, right? I'm not going to do that for a lot of reasons. I could spend a whole episode. Let's just say there's too many good reasons to count not to do that. And that's really lazy to do that. What's much more interesting is to build a culture from the ground up and use as many other cultures as you can get exposure to for ideas for elements of that culture. But don't just make your version of ancient Rome or whatever. For one thing, it's just unoriginal, and the players are going to figure it out, right? If this is, if this land in your world is the Incan Empire, people are going to figure it out eventually. And then I don't know, it just loses something. It's like, oh, well, this is just the Incan Empire, right? And there's also, in this modern day, this interconnected world where we're playing games online, maybe with people from totally different countries and cultures than ourselves. And, some of us are streaming to the world online. You don't want to offend people you don't want to offend people when you don't mean to, is what I want to say. Because personally, I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with offending people. I think a lot of times people being offended, the problem is with the person who's offended. And everybody's free to be who they are. And if you don't like it, then you don't have to like it, right? But you don't want to offend people by accident. You don't want to offend people because you're just ignorant or because you just don't understand why what you're doing is offensive, right? If you're offending people and it's a calculated thing that you intend to do, then fine. But at least me personally, I don't want to offend people and not even mean to, right? And a great way that you can offend people is to take someone's culture and use it in your game and, use too many stereotypes and turn too many of those stereotypes up to 11, and you could have some problems. So yeah, that's another good reason to avoid that kind of thing. But yeah, and the assumption you're making about Alondria is a fair assumption, if only because that's what you see all the time. But I don't know that that's going to be an accurate assumption. I don't think I'm personally going to be happy with any city or any land in my world being just a generic Tolkien culture or a generic, European medieval culture or whatever, because it's been done and overdone, and it's not interesting anymore. If it ever was, maybe back in the 70s it was interesting, but yeah, I'd like to think I'm more creative. And with my background in anthropology, I don't have any excuse not to be more creative than that. But to be honest, I haven't given a whole lot of thought to that kind of stuff yet, because I've been working so much on just the nuts and bolts of, things that are more, more physical. Like, what do people do for a living? Where does their food come from? Where does their money come from? Do they even have money? Things like that. And, worrying about the gods and whatnot, I've started thinking about religion, which of course is culture. So, I'm getting to the point where I'm going to start thinking about that. And definitely Alondria will be the first culture that I develop. I will tell you that in my studies in anthropology, I focused a lot on South and Central America. So I'd say there's a good chance you will see elements of various, Mesoamerican and South American indigenous cultures here and there. But again, my intent is not to take a particular culture and recreate it, but rather to take an element from this culture over there and an element from that culture over there and an element from still another culture over there and put them together into something new and interesting. So we'll see how I do on that. But as far as people finding themselves in Primordia, that's not going to be a problem. My idea, and this is a whole can of worms. I'm not really going to go into details right now, but basically, for Alondria specifically, and really for Primordia as a whole, you don't really have the thing of like, oh, people from this part of the world look like Africans on Earth, and people from this part of the world look like Eskimos on Earth, and people from this part of the world look like, I don't know, Caucasians from Earth. You see what I'm saying? Like the phenotypes, the various human phenotypes do not map on Primordia to like, oh, really dark-skinned people are from here and people with blue eyes are from there, because the world is really old, and not so much now, but in older times, there was a lot of travel and trade. And so the populations became very mixed. So in Alondria right now, you know, if someone wanted to make a player character, they could make that player character look like anything they wanted and it would fit. I mean, Alondria is pretty diverse city to begin with, and Primordia itself is very much kind of a melting pot, as we say here in America, of not only cultures and ethnicities, but phenotypes. So yeah. So I'm kind of sidestepping that whole mess in that way. And that way, you know, if I'm running a game in a public place with strangers and I don't know who's going to show up at my table, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter what ethnicity a given player is. It doesn't matter what gender orientation a given player is. They can play whatever they want and it will fit in Alondria. It will fit in Primordia. It's not a problem. And if you're designing your own world, and if you're planning on either maybe publishing it or releasing it, you know, online, or running for more than just your group of friends that you've played with forever, then I would suggest you do something similar with your world. Because if you're going to be running at conventions or in game stores or online, you never know who your players are going to be, and you don't want to miss out on an awesome player because they didn't feel comfortable in your game because they were gay or because they were black or whatever, right? You want everybody to feel comfortable and to be represented in your world, at least if you care about welcoming people to your table. So, yeah. Anywho, G-Ferg says, sorry if I'm rambling. Hey, I'm rambling too. It's all right. I just got excited at my mentioning in the podcast, and I also don't get to talk about games or world building as much anymore. So I tend to get a bit silly when I have the chance. Thanks again. Thank you so much for the email, G-Ferg. Really appreciate it. And I've heard that from other people as well that write into me that say, hey, you know, for whatever reason, I don't get to hang out and talk about RPGs very much anymore. And so, you know, this show is a chance to do that. And, you know, I'm in the same boat myself. You know, my wife doesn't play RPGs, couldn't care less about RPGs. And, you know, I could talk to her about it, but it's kind of like talking to my cat about it. I mean, all right, that's not very nice, is it? That's not fair. I get more interaction from my wife than I do from my cat, but still, it's like she's not really into it. You know what I mean? She's being polite, she's listening, but she's not really into it. And you know how it is. It's much more fun to talk about someone who's into what you're talking about and is actually going to have a conversation with you about it, right? And have their own ideas. And for some of us, you know, we just don't have that in our day-to-day lives. And, you know, I'm in that boat myself. And that's one of the reasons I started GM Intrusions way back when, was so that I could talk about RPGs, if only by myself to a microphone. But I'm not really by myself anymore because I have your feedback, which is awesome. Brett McLean commented on the post for episode 109 on the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community. So every time I put out an episode, I make a post in that community, and a lot of times people will comment on that. So the Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey is another great way to connect with other listeners and talk about RPG stuff. And you can find a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. And I'll have a link to that post in the show notes for this episode. So Brett says, I like the advice about making the gods relevant for all characters, but then turning it up a notch for the actual clerics and paladins. We as GMs, game designers, and or world builders need to think of the pantheons beyond just the simple chapter of the book that discusses them in detail. Yeah, I totally agree. And, I covered this on the world building episode, episode 109. But I feel like that's what it is in a lot of settings, and also in a lot of just games that GMs run is, the gods and all that are just almost like an appendix item. They're like an addendum, and they're only really used if someone plays a cleric, and even then maybe they're not used that much, or they're not used very well, or whatever. I really feel that the gods are huge missed opportunities in most campaigns. And like I said in that episode, I kind of think that you want to either make the gods relevant to everyone all the time and make them a real element of the story of your game, or get rid of them because they're way too cool to have them there and not be relevant. And if they're there and not relevant, what's the point? Just get rid of them. So yeah, I was talking about ways to make the cleric a more attractive option for players to play. And one of my suggestions is make the gods relevant all the time to everybody. And then if there's a cleric PC, then it becomes even more so for them. Because one of the perceived drawbacks of playing a cleric by a lot of players is that if someone plays a cleric, we're going to have to deal with the gods, where if nobody plays a cleric, we might not have to. And not only can that be a deterrent for an individual player who's considering playing cleric, but it's also a deterrent for the group as a whole. And I've heard people say this, we don't want a cleric in the group because then we're going to be involved with the gods and we're going to have to deal with that. So if you force the players to be involved with the gods no matter what, it pulls the teeth out of that. And so now people can play a cleric if they want and not feel like they're screwing over the group because now they have to deal with the gods. Brett says, too often, the gods and pantheons are an afterthought for players and GMs alike, unless there's a cleric in the party. I'm not sure I've ever seen someone play a devout character that wasn't a cleric or other divine class. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I've tried it myself, but I've never seen someone else do it. I think I just found a part of my next character's persona. Yeah, totally. And, when I played Pathfinder, I made characters that were really into a given god. And, Pathfinder at least makes an attempt in Galarian to have something sort of kind of like polytheism in their elves, which they talk about the elves being more actually polytheistic, where they tend to worship the entire elven pantheon instead of a given deity. And I had an elf character where I actually had the elven gods prioritized. These are my favorite gods, right? So number 1 was this god, and 2 and 3 were these gods, because that's how I figured my character looked at it, is I honor all the gods, but there are definitely ones that I like more because they're more relevant to me in some way. So yeah, if you're playing in a world or you're GMing a world where the gods are relevant and interesting, then, that becomes another dimension of someone's character, even if, like Brett is saying, you're not a divine caster. You could just be a wizard or a fighter who is a really strong follower of a certain god or certain gods. And that can be a new role-playing avenue that you can explore with that character. It's super cool. Robert Poulin also commented on episode 109 on the Google Plus community and said, in my opinion, religious organizations, temples, and churches should have a bigger impact than the gods themselves on the lives of the PCs. Yeah, I completely agree, especially at lower levels. Having a few developed clergies is also a great way to interest players in playing clerics in the acolyte background. Yeah, that's a good point. History has shown that clergies can be powerful social forces without any divine influence. Yeah, I mean, look at the Catholic Church. I don't really need to say any more than that, do I? If you know history at all, and if you don't, learn some history. Might change the way you look at religion in the world. Definitely changed my outlook when I found out the way things really went down. So yeah, I think that's totally true. And, I talked about this in episode 109 a little bit, that, there are ways to use the gods without having an avatar or the god show up or having your characters brought to the god's plane, right? They got to deal with the worshipers of the god, people that believe in the god. They have to deal with the church of the god and the clerics and the priests and all that. And, especially like Robert's saying at lower levels, that's much more appropriate than, having angels show up or whatever. So yeah, think outside the box. Christopher Rusenbeck wrote in on the Google Plus community about godless fantasy. So here's an idea for you. He was listening to episode 109 and he says, it got me thinking. Sounds like a lot of cleric paladin pushback seems to stem from the pantheons, not the classes themselves. Yeah, that was kind of my thesis of that episode, or of this whole series, is I think that the majority of problems that most people who are having problems with the cleric, those problems are coming from the gods and the pantheons and how they're handled by the setting and how they're handled by the DM, not so much the class mechanics. So Christopher says, what, if anything, would change if the gods were removed entirely from the picture? I'd say as far as the game mechanics, nothing would change. There are plenty of fantasy stories that don't have divine intervention, and some don't even bother with gods at all. For example, A Song of Ice and Fire has gods, sure, but they're not D&D gods where they actively meddle with the affairs of mortals. Heck, it's not even known, as far as I know, if they are even real. The Warcraft franchise as well doesn't have active gods. The Aragon series, I could go on. So yeah, Lord of the Rings, there's no gods in Lord of the Rings. There's no gods in Conan, I don't think. So those were two heavy influencers on D&D in the early days. My question is, how would your games change, if at all, if there were no gods, or the gods were just worship, but no actual proof of their existence was given? And divine spells don't count, since bards, druids, wizards, etc. can also cast the same spells. Well, I would argue that divine spells do count. And, that's the problem with going that route of saying, well, we don't know if the gods exist or not. Well, I would say that the fact that there are clerics who can do miracles is kind of at least evidence supporting the idea that the gods exist. Now, that power could come from something other than a god, like the warlock patrons, but it's coming from somewhere, right? And bards share some spells with clerics, and so do wizards, but they can't cast them all. Wizards can't cast resurrection. So yeah, if you're gonna go the route of saying, we don't know if the gods are real or not in my world, then that's a problem you'd have to figure out. How are you going to deal with divine magic? How are you going to deal with these things that clerics can do that nobody else can do? How are you going to explain that? I'm not saying that you can't, but you'd have to find an answer to that question, right? But I think as far as, day-to-day gameplay and the mechanics of the game, I don't think it's going to change anything. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's still in the player's handbook, the possibility of playing a cleric who isn't devoted to a god, and the same thing with a paladin, but is instead devoted to an ideal or an alignment or whatever. So it's actually in the game, like you can do that, and it doesn't change anything mechanically, I don't think. It's just going to affect the flavor of your world. It's a very different place if the gods are real and it's known that they're real versus a place where, like Game of Thrones, where it's like people believe in the gods, but you don't really know if they're real or not, And I would argue, and even in a good D&D setting, it's kind of the same way, because the gods don't usually walk around the marketplace, right? So your average everyday person doesn't have any proof that the gods are real beyond, the cleric healing people or whatever. So I don't know. I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot you could do there. And that's definitely a way, if you're building your own world, that you could kind of set it apart from other D&D worlds, is if you did something different with the gods. If maybe there are no gods in your world, or maybe instead of gods, there's just these primal forces that are represented by the domains or maybe the alignments. Or maybe it's a mystery. Maybe people believe in gods and there's clerics and they have powers, but maybe no one really knows for sure where those powers come from. Or maybe people think that they come from the gods, but you as a DM know that they don't. They come from something else. That could be interesting too. So I think as far as like gameplay and mechanics, I don't think your game would change much, if at all. But I think it definitely would have a huge impact on your setting to do something like that. And it could be really cool. And like, it could be a way to make your setting unique. So definitely not saying you shouldn't do it. Yeah, maybe you should. It depends on your world, I guess. I was just thinking about gods of Primordia, and I don't want to go too much into world building stuff onto this, but I guess since we're talking about it, I have 9 gods, right? And I've talked a lot in the world building episodes about why I have 9 gods, and I don't want a bunch of gods. But when you think about the kind of the shtick of Primordia is this place of like almost like not a temporal, but a planar nexus that kind of pulls things into it. So, if you're plane traveling and you have some kind of mishap that sends you to a random place, you're more likely to end up in Primordia. So in a place like that, with all these portals coming in from other planes and rifts opening to other planes all the time, the assumption I would think would be that there would be all kinds of gods, dozens, maybe even hundreds or even thousands of gods, because gods could come from other planes, other places, and people who come from other planes and other places and settle on Primordia would bring their own gods and their own beliefs with them, right? But I don't want that. I don't want this to be the Forgotten Realms or worse, where we've got dozens and dozens of pantheons and hundreds of deities, and it's just a big mess that no one can keep track of. I don't want that, right? So that's a, quote, problem that I have to solve. So it's like the assumption would be there's lots of gods. There aren't lots of gods. So the question is why? And I, as a world designer, I need to come up with a reason why there's not dozens of gods, why there's only 9. So I gave it some thought and I came up with various ideas. But the idea that I'm kind of leaning toward right now is actually the first idea I came up with, which usually you don't want to use the first idea. It's also the simplest idea. And that's just that the gods are really powerful. The gods of Primordia are so powerful that they have a monopoly on their domains. So the god of nature is the only god of nature, and there can be no other god of nature because Primordia will not allow access to that domain or that portfolio to another deity. So for another deity to come into Primordia and be like, I want to be a god of nature too, like Forgotten Realms. How many gods of fucking nature are there in Forgotten Realms? Let's see. There's Myliki, there's Shantea, there's elven gods. We've got Rilithane, Ralathil. I don't know. There's tons of them. I can't remember them all. But you get my meaning. There's lots of nature gods in Forgotten Realms. Well, it doesn't work that way in Primordia. If you want to be a god of nature, you got to take that power from the current god of nature, who's Primordia, and you're not going to be able to because she's a badass. So, one of the sticking points for me was this conception of the deity power levels in D&D and how like your lesser gods are the ones that are more likely to be like the Greek gods from Homeric times, where they might actually walk among people and things like that. Like that's your lesser gods, your demigods that do that. Where your greater gods are more like these abstractions and they've got things going on higher planes, and they don't pay much attention to the prime material plane. They certainly don't go there in physical form and walk around amongst the people and whatnot. So that was kind of a sticking point for me because I wanted my gods to be basically greater gods in power level, but I wanted them to behave more like lesser gods. So again, as the dungeon master and as a world builder, I can do what I want. So I decided that that's what my gods are. They're greater gods as far as power level, but as far as how they interact with their followers and how they behave, They're much more like lesser gods. But because they're greater gods and they have this kind of coalition among themselves, they're able to jealously guard their power and their portfolios from any kind of interlopers that might come in from somewhere else. And so what happens is if you have a group of people that settle from another plane and they've got their god of whatever that they worship from this other place, and they're still going to worship that god, right? Well, instead of that god now having a presence on Primordia, instead what happens is the god that is closest to that god already on Primordia will have an aspect develop for that people. And they may even call that aspect, at least for a time, by the name of their old god. But eventually the Primordian god is going to break them of that and get them using the correct name. So that's what I mean when I say that, deciding there are no gods in your world or that the gods are unknown creates a, quote, problem. It's not saying that that's a bad thing and you shouldn't do it, but it does create a problem that you need to solve in the same way that I needed to solve my problem of only wanting to have 9 gods in this world that's kind of a planar nexus and figuring out how I can have that make sense. All right, so there's quite a bit of discussion in this thread on the Google Plus community on episode 109 about, gods in your world and taking gods out and whatnot. And DM Nell pitched in and said, that is pretty much my campaign. There is a religion with clerics, but the gods, if they exist, do not interact with the world at all. So that's a way you can go is, you've got clerics, they've got their spells and, they can do what their spells say they can do, but that's it. And there's really no other evidence of the gods even existing in the world beyond that. Brett McLean weighed in and said, as a generality, I don't think a lack of gods in a world setting would influence the campaigns or adventures in that setting much, except in 2 specific situations. Number 1, if there's a cleric or paladin in the party, a lack of a specific deity will color how that character worships and what he reveres. And number 2, the story plot involves the influence of the gods. Obviously, you either can't run these types of games in such a setting, or you need to find an alternative way of having divine intervention. If neither of these situations present themselves, then I don't think players or GMs tend to give the gods much thought, in which case they don't even have to be a thing in that setting. I think that's true, but I think that's failing on the part of us as GMs. If you look at primitive societies, which are what our cultures in these RPGs are based on, religion was a huge part of their everyday life. And, it's kind of hard for some of us to imagine in this day and age, but, for primitive peoples, they, everything they did in their day-to-day life was couched in mysticism and religion and had some kind of significance. Everything from what you ate to how you dressed to what kind of crops you grow to what kind of animals you consider okay to eat versus what kind of animals are not okay to eat. All these things are influenced by religion. So I think having a world without religion would be a big change and would have an impact. And even if the gods aren't real in your world, you can still have religions, right? I mean, we have religions in our world. And those religions will have a huge impact on your setting and on things that happen. So, I kind of see it as 2 different things. Do you have gods in your world? And do you have religion in your world? Those are 2 different things. Having one doesn't necessarily mean you have the other. And not having one doesn't necessarily mean you don't have the other. Of course, the presence or lack of gods will influence the flavor of the setting, and so would potentially have dramatic impact on the cultures and NPCs if the GM or players chose to give such things their attention. If no one is worried about what churches are in the town or how the NPCs might worship, then the gods aren't required. See, again, I disagree. Just because the PCs don't care about the religion doesn't mean it's not relevant. And, if you're properly portraying a setting like that, the religion would be very relevant. Even if none of the PCs cared about it, every single NPC you meet is going to care about it. And it's going to be in your face all the time. And, I have to point out that clerics and paladins and gods don't necessarily really, quote, belong in D&D at all. They're only in the game because Gygax was a Jehovah's Witness. And he was really into the Crusades. So he wanted clerics and paladins and all that crap in the game. D&D grew out of the sword and sorcery tradition, and that stuff wasn't part of that tradition. And it wasn't part of Tolkien either. You don't really see any gods in Tolkien until you get into like the Silmarillion. There's no clerics or paladins in the Lord of the Rings. So I think a setting without gods could be really cool. And I think, if you wanted to have a setting without gods, you could either get rid of clerics and paladins, or you could still have clerics and paladins and just say their power comes from somewhere or something else. And what that somewhere or something else is could be really interesting and could really give a unique spin to your setting. Or maybe, clerics and paladins even worship gods, but the gods aren't real and their power is really coming from somewhere else and they don't realize it. I mean, that could be a really cool reveal later in the campaign when the player of a cleric or a paladin finds out that their god doesn't actually exist and their power is coming from something else. Personally, I decided to keep clerics and paladins and gods in Primordia, partly because I didn't want to change the game mechanics too much. I didn't want to just start taking classes out of the game. And partly because I think that I can make the gods and religions work and make them more interesting and relevant and fun. I think gods can work great as manipulators behind the scenes. I kind of see them almost like the antediluvians in Vampire the Masquerade. They're working behind the scenes, pulling strings through their various minions and servants, making things happen. And no one really knows what they're up to. No one really knows what their end game is. Another great example of this kind of thing are the Forsaken and the Black Aja in the Wheel of Time series is another great example of, people being behind the scenes, pulling strings, making things happen. And no one really knows what their end goal is. For sure. So yeah, I definitely would not recommend to you any particular course as far as, whether to have gods or not, whether to say they're real or not, or that kind of thing. I would just recommend, again, that, if you are going to have gods in your setting, make them matter and make them interesting and make them relevant. And it shouldn't matter what your player characters roll up. The cosmos does not revolve around the player characters. Just because no one plays a cleric doesn't mean religion doesn't matter in the world. Doesn't mean that they're not going to be running into other people who believe in the gods every step of the way, every day of their lives. So this episode has been all about feedback, and I hope I get a lot more feedback from you that can help power future episodes of the show. A great way to reach me is by email at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also visit the website at starwalkerstudios.com/gamemastersjourney. You can find all my contact information, all the ways you can get a hold of me and get in touch with the show there. You can also follow me on Twitter at LexStarwalker. You can follow me on Google Plus LexStarwalker. I'm also on YouTube, Facebook, Pinterest, Reddit. I'm all over the place. You can find links, all that stuff at starwalkerstudios.com. So that is going to about wrap up our first Unplugged feedback episode in a while. Had a lot of fun with this, a lot of great thoughts from people on the feedback, and yeah, I just want to reiterate, these are just my thoughts and opinions that I present on the show. There is no one right way to be a game master, and don't let anyone tell you there is. I don't care who they are or who they think they are. Don't let anybody tell you that their way is the only way or that their way is the best way. The best way is what works best for you and your group. And, I think the RPG community, especially online, is kind of an echo chamber. And you have a few really loud voices that keep saying the same things over and over and over again. And people tend to think that that's the way, and that's the only way, and that's the best way, just because they're hearing it all the time. But there's always more than one way to do things. There's always more than one opinion on anything, really. Being a game master is a creative endeavor, and we're all going to approach it a little bit differently. The whole point of this show is to present as much to you as I can so that you can kind of pick and choose what works for you and what works for your group. And, I've been running games for well over 20 years now, and I've run a lot of different games for a lot of different groups of people, a lot of different campaigns. And I can tell you that, I don't run every campaign the same. I don't run every game the same. My approach as a game master varies based on the game I'm running, the campaign I'm running, the people in my group, all kinds of stuff, So there is no one right way, even for me personally. So there's certainly no one right way for everybody. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Stanko, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.